South. Nice to see a big crowd for this. Hope you're all geared up and ready to go out and advocate. And that's what this is all about. I'm Arthur Feinstein. I'm the chair of the Bay Alive Committee, our Sierra Club, San Francisco Bay Sea Level Rise Committee. And we can go to the next slide. And also talking today will be our co-chair, Geeta Dev, and we have Jen Hedderly, Jenna Holt, and Dash Leeds, who will also be, and Wills Kane, I think. So quite a few people who are going to be taking time out to help you get ready to advocate on keeping our bay healthy and alive. And as you can see on this slide, the Bay Alive Committee has three major goals, and one is just what the RSAP, as we call the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan of BCDC, does is to have a regional approach to adaptation and not let local community by local community decide whether they want a seawall and then they don't know what else to do. We also want to prioritize natural and nature-based sea level rise solutions. We'll get into that a little later. And of course, promote environmental justice and equity in planning and implementation and everything that has to do with the whole process. Next slide. So tonight's goals are to introduce you to BCDC, give you an idea of who they are, what they do, and then talk about the guidelines, what's good and what's bad. And then once you get that, we start talking about what you're here for, which is the talking points, what you're going to say when you have a chance for public comment at BCDC and elsewhere, and also provide support for submitting written comments. Next slide. So who's BCDC? Well, way back when, and now it is way back when, in the early and middle parts of the 20th century, San Francisco Bay was being filled for development and for tossing garbage, lost a third of the bay to fill. And then the 60s, people started getting a little tired of it. The bay started to smell. It became very, very polluted. A lot of reasons for people to say we need to do something, and so they did. And we got the San Francisco Bay Development and Conservation and Development Commission created just about 1970, 69, 70, through the McAteer-Petrus Act was the two gentlemen who wrote the legislation. So in BCDC, there are 27 members who were appointed. They come from state agencies, the legislature, and cities and counties. Many of them are local officials, so they're actually answerable to the constituents because they get elected, which helps because they tend to listen to us when we do advocate because they need to be popular. BCDC at that time was the first entity in the state that was given the power to control waters of the state. The Coastal Commission did not exist at that time. And so in drafting that legislation, they gave BCDC the regulatory power only to the high tide line, which is somewhat restrictive. If you are familiar with the Coastal Commission at all, their jurisdiction can extend 1,000, 2,000 feet inland from the ocean. At that time, when BCDC was created, they were basically created to stop bay fill. As I said, the bay was shrinking. They put a stop to that. But they do have part of their planning and regulatory process is to protect habitats and environment. When sea level rise became obvious to people, BCDC did recognize that's a threat to the bay that they're supposed to be protecting, and they had a whole series of programs to address that. In 2011, they actually adopted some Bay Plan amendments. Their regulations are all part of something called the Bay Plan, And if they want to change what they can do, they need a Bay Plan amendment. And in fact, they are proposing to make the RSAP a Bay Plan amendment, and then that will give them the regulatory authority for where they have that authority. Anyway, in 2011, they did pass climate change amendments, but they were all narrative ones saying, wouldn't it be nice if we could keep the Bay healthy? But they didn't address any regulatory changes. So it really didn't change the playing field at all. Not until 2023, last year, did things change. And if we can have the next slide. John Laird, Santa Cruz senator, decided to pass a bill that did something about the threat of sea level rise to the coast and to San Francisco Bay. And so he drafted SB 272, Senate Bill 272. In 2022, it was first presented and was vetoed. In 2023, it was presented again. We had a chance at that time to comment on it to the senator, and it was made a little bit stronger and was actually signed into law by Governor Newsom. And what did SB 272 do? It said sea level rise is the threat, and all shoreline communities in California should create adaptation plans for sea level rise. And for BCDC in specific, by December 31st of 2024, they have to develop the guidelines by which these local governments will develop these shoreline adaptation plans. They don't have to actually complete those plans until 2034. They have 10 years to work on them, and they're so complex it might take that. And each community must develop these sub-regional shoreline adaptation plans and present them to BCDC, and BCDC has to either approve or deny them. If it's approved, it means that that jurisdiction is given a carrot because they are prioritized for getting state funding for coastal adaptation. It's not clear what happens if that plan is denied, except that they no longer are primed for getting funding for that work. Next. Before they got to 2023 and 2022, and after they did their first climate adaptation plan, BCDC had several other processes, and one was called Bay Adapt. And the Bay Adapt plan was just what it says, that it was a process where they developed principles for how to respond to sea level rise. And those 6 principles are called out in SB 272, and the bill says that in developing the guidelines for these sub-regional adaptation plans, these 6 guiding principles must be applied. And if you look at number 2, you'll see it puts nature first whenever possible. And numbers 1 and 4 are both very important for our equitable efforts, social equity efforts. Next. So this is what the document looks like, the first page, the cover page. As you can see, I mean, it's a big thing. As sea level rises projected to go up to 6-7 feet, and scientists, some still are saying 10 feet by 2100 or past. It's going to be a serious, if you're following the hurricane in Florida, it's going to be a little bit like that. It's going to really make a change to our communities, and we're going to have to do something. But if all we do is put up hard walls around and create a bathtub, then all of our shallow water habitats are going to die. And those are the ones that make the bay a living bay. Their vegetation provides oxygen and food for all kinds of critters, from fish to shellfish to protozoans. They're the heart of our aquatic ecosystem, and they need air, most of them, at some time during the daily life cycle. And so they're going to drown for most of them. And then the bay will become lifeless for the most part. And we might even start getting more harmful algae blooms because our wetlands help prevent that. So we have this wonderful opportunity through SB 272 and the guidelines to insist that local communities actually look at nature, try and preserve a healthy bay, and not just resort to what would to them seem the most obvious thing and put up a seawall. Next one. So we now have a draft. This is what we're hoping you will comment on. That's some of us have been working on for 6 months. Myself and another committee member have been on their advisory committee, and Gita is on their implementation committee for this process. And they have been responsive to a lot of our comments. At the beginning, they looked at the bay as just a pretty thing. And now they actually recognize that it's important economically and ecologically and needs to be preserved. But they haven't gone quite far enough. You'll see more of that later. It's 200 pages. It's long. It's very confusing, very complex. Uh, but don't worry, you don't have to read it all. In fact, you don't have to read any of it because we're going to give you talking points. If you're interested in really getting into it, the first 40 pages of the introduction are actually very helpful and very interesting. But we're going to give you the primary issues and talking points, so not to worry. Next slide. So very quickly, what's in it? There's an introduction and executive summary and introduction. There's 3 sections. That's the introduction. The second section is something called One Bay Vision and Strategic Regional Priorities. Next slide, please. The One Bay Vision is their vision of what's going to come out of this process. And if you look at the top, you'll see ecosystem health and resilience. That's one of the 8 basic elements that they're saying have to be looked at. And they have a series of goals for ecosystem health and resilience. Next slide. They also have something called strategic regional priorities. And this is based on the idea that along much of the shoreline, the different infrastructural elements are larger than just one community. And the strategic regional priorities are basically saying, if in your area you are part of a strategic regional priority area, you need to be looking at your adjacent communities and seeing how you can work together so you can have complete and connected ecosystems, for example, and connected regional shoreline access. Next slide. And this is section 3 where we get down to the nitty-gritty. This is the actual guidelines. So if you're a planner, this is the section you look at. It has all these check-off boxes and check-off elements that tell you exactly what's supposed to be in this regional plan. It's confusing as heck going through it. There's at least 62 checkoffs under the complete plan submittal checklist. And before that, you have sub-regional plan elements and minimum standards. And you have, for us in particular, shoreline adaptation standards, which where they actually identify what you should be looking at in terms of our shallow water habitats. Next slide. And they have minimum standards and just a whole lot of stuff. And minimum standards basically says if you have shoreline habitats, and they list a whole bunch of them from wetlands to oyster reefs to all kinds of stuff, and you have to look and identify whether they're in your area if you're the planner. And the last and the most important one is adaptation strategy standards. And these are 20 standards, 20 requirements that must be followed when you develop your plan. And 2 of them, at least, are very good for us, if a little bit, well, they're just pretty good. It's just that they're hidden among all these hundreds of other checklists, and you never know if they're going to actually be seen or not. Next. That was it for me. That's sort of what's in there. Now Gita is going to tell you what we like and don't like. take it away. You're muted, Gita.
Thank you, Arthur. That was a nice introduction. And so I just want to remind everyone that when we started on looking at the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, or the RSAP, as everyone calling it now, we had 3 goals in mind, and I just wanted to remind everyone about them. One was that we really wanted to prioritize nature-based adaptation. And we recognized that people did not realize that nature was a powerful force in the adaptation area, and that it's the only way to keep the bay alive, in fact. The second one was that this issue of equity, there are some communities like Foster City that are pretty wealthy. They could pass themselves a bond for 30 years. They all easily voted. I think it got like over 80% yes vote, and they're paying for a levy to be raised higher. However, other communities that are not so well off, such as East Palo Alto, may not be able to pay for something like that. So we recognize there's an equity problem. There's a lot of communities around the Bay that are not wealthy, and that's an issue of environmental justice. Not only are they not wealthy, but they also tend to have a lot of contamination. So Sierra Club felt that equity was a really important issue for us too. And we have, in our process, reached out to communities without being overwhelming. We just wanted to be there, to be an asset to them, to be a resource to them, as they are trying to work with BCDC, who they don't trust at all. The third part was to acknowledge, again, this comes back to the nature-based adaptation, acknowledge the importance of phased adaptive pathways. And this is where you have a plan to do adaptation, which is spread out over time because it gives time for nature to adapt and grow. So if you want to do a gray infrastructure, a seawall, in 6 months, you build it and it's done, nature wouldn't be able to keep up within 6 months. So the idea of pathways and adaptation over time is something that we wanted them to consider and introduce. So these were 3 things that we had in mind. Next. So as Arthur said, I'll reiterate that this is the final draft that has come out. We have a 1-month comment period for all of us to comment by October the 18th. And the commission meeting for any oral comments would be the day before that, on the 17th. Now, I see a lot of familiar faces in our group here, and I hope that you will all feel really comfortable by the end of this to make an oral comment at the commission meeting. And if you can't, to write an email to them or send a letter. An email letter would be very powerful from any individual. Next, please. So I just wanted to reiterate what Arthur has said. If you look at the RSAP, which is over 200 pages, it really is in these 2 parts. The first part is a narrative part, and it can be read. The second part is the technical part, which is when you are actually doing a plan. These are all the things you have to do. Now, the devil is in the details. That is true. And as Arthur pointed out, some of the things that we think are most important are at the very bottom in those minimum requirements for sea level rise plans. So I would say if you do look at it, be prepared to be confused because it's very repetitive. The 6 guiding principles overlap the next one, the 1 Bay vision with the 8 parts, and that overlaps with strategic regional priorities. So be prepared to be a bit confused, but that's why we decided to have this webinar, because we wanted to simplify and clarify it because we've spent some time on this. Next, please. So let's go into what it is that we like about what the RSAP has done so far. One thing is the bay habitats and ecosystems are now in there throughout. They're recognized for their value. And it's no longer just, it's the beauty of the bay, and the bay is so beautiful and it's got recreational opportunities. So this is very important to us because the bay itself is at risk. And if they didn't recognize that those ecosystems could die, and then we would all be in trouble. The second issue is that nature-based solutions must be used according to the law, according to Bay Adapt guiding principles, to the greatest extent feasible before using or before considering traditional hardscape. This is not something that cities or public works departments that do the sea level rise studies on the adaptation plans, they don't think about that. They think about levees, seawalls, pumps, pipes, things like that. They're civil engineers, and so that's natural. So we like the fact that they have introduced and emphasized, put it in minimum standards, and sprinkled it throughout. This is a huge, huge change. This is like turning the ship around. And we really do take a lot of credit. We should take a lot of credit for that because we have been at them for a year. Now, adaptation pathways, which was one of our priorities because it allows nature time to adapt, is included in the minimum standards. It's at the bottom of the minimum. It's the very last thing. So it just needs more emphasis early on. It needs to be recognized and appreciated earlier. But we like the fact that they've got it in, and it's one of the required minimum standards. They've got, I think, about 4 or 5 of them in there. Equity is given importance, which we like. It's given huge importance, actually. Every single section, whether you're organizing the plan, you're looking at existing conditions, you're planning it, you're funding it, whatever, they have a little section on equity that you have to fill out. So that's great. I think they've done a good job. We are no experts on this, but we believe that they have really tried. And contamination cleanup is also in there. It's prioritized, but it's confined to the environmental justice communities, the vulnerable communities. That's where they say that you have to focus on environmental contamination cleanup. So these are the things that we like. Next, please. So, when we say, yes, it's good, what you guys have done is really good. The staff have listened to us. Why are you coming back to us and saying, yes, but, yes, but what is missing? So this is what we feel is missing. The fact that the bay itself is at risk is in the very introduction. They say the baylands are at risk, but it doesn't clarify that only nature-based solutions can help this situation. That needs to be articulated very clearly, and that is not as clear, even though they put nature-based solutions in the minimum required standards. It's not clearly articulated that the bay is at risk and nature-based solutions, every single city needs to be doing nature-based solutions. So the other thing that's missing is that the nature-based solutions should be the first thing you consider, not the afterthought. And it should be considered not only the first thing, but for all projects. If you're doing a housing project on the shoreline, your nature-based solutions should be the first thing you consider for sea level rise adaptation. That clarity is not in there. Adaptation pathways, as we've talked about, need to be integrated early on more clearly. They need to be, it's a very new idea. Adaptation pathways is coming up worldwide. I think the first time the word was coined was in 2010. So it's a new idea of how you can adapt to sea level rise in a sequential way because the future is so uncertain, policies that come up are uncertain, funding is uncertain, and you need to be able to adapt as time goes. After a few years, there may be new policies, new sea level rise projections, new funding sources. So you need time to adapt. And there may be new techniques. Also, who knows? Maybe the world will come around and we'll stop having climate change to such a great extent. So, the future is uncertain, and we are looking to 2100 at least. So adaptation pathways needs to be considered in a way more strongly. And another item that's missing is not that rising groundwater is missing. It has been put in, which is new. Rising groundwater only came up about 3 years ago, and it is in the RSAP, but it's only recognized for causing flooding. If rising groundwater becomes emergent and it causes flooding, therefore the ground can no longer absorb water, for example. However, we are concerned that there are a lot of contaminated sites around the bay. There are over, hundreds of them. They are landfills as well as buried contaminants, legacy contaminants from industry. And the groundwater rise has the potential for mobilizing these contaminants all around the bay and into the bay. That is not clearly recognized, the danger of rising groundwater. And finally, we feel what is really missing is, how do you know if what you're doing is working at all? Or how do you know if you're doing something and something else is going against it? Are you building on the lands, are you building right up against the bay at the same time as you say you're doing nature-based adaptation? So what are the metrics for measuring? They say that 5 years later, everyone has to measure how they're doing. And then 10 years later, again, well, how do you know if it's working? So next. So we've tried to bring it down to just sort of 4 areas. One is that the bay itself is at risk. We've talked about this, to recognize these are the things that we want them to ask about. These are the gaps. These are what the things we want them to fill in. To recognize that nature-based solutions is the only way that each city can contribute to keeping these systems alive. And as Arthur's pointed out, we depend on them. Our economy depends on them. So the other one is that there is, in fact, an established goal of 100,000 total acres of wetlands. There were 200,000 acres plus. We went down, and we went down to less than 50, and now we are up to 54, I believe. But the goal is to do 100,000 or maybe even 125,000. That needs to be in there, loud and clear. That's not in there. Emphasize adaptation pathways early on. We talked about that. Next, please. And the other 3 are that in the guidelines section, so the first part was more in the narrative section as well as the guidelines, but in the guidelines section, which is section 3, these are the checklists. We felt that nature and nature-based solutions need to be in every section of the plan guidelines. They are not in every section. Equity is in every section, but nature is not in every section. So we felt that that was really important to get into the plan guidelines in every section. The third item was this issue about contamination and groundwater, that we felt that all shoreline plans, not just the ones in environmental justice communities, all around the shoreline, they need to analyze their potential to release contaminants. When groundwater is rising with sea level rise, and that is an important aspect for the bay and for the communities. And finally, the issue of metrics, which we've talked about. Unless you have something to measure, you will never really know whether this community A is meeting its goals and community B is not meeting its goals. you know, or even within community A, if the city council needs a report, are we meeting our goals? Did we, whatever the goals are, we need metrics to measure. That's critical. Next, please. And so these are the 4 gaps that we feel are really important. And now I'll turn it over to Jenna to talk about how we can do that. Oh, I guess we said we wanted to take a break if there were any burning questions that anyone had. Otherwise, we will go to Jenna and then Dash. And after that, we do have a breakout session, where you can also ask more questions. So if anyone has their hand up, does anyone have their hand up? I can't see everyone. If not, let's move on to Jenna. Thank you all for coming. I really do think that it's great that there are some of us who are ready to speak up. Next slide.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jenna Hout. I am the Bay Alive campaign assistant on staff with the Loma Prieta chapter. And I'm going to be going over what BCDC needs to hear from you in your public comment on the RSAP. Next slide, please. So the good news about the RSAP is it reflects a lot of our advocacy efforts alongside a lot of like-minded organizations and incorporates a significant amount of our previous asks. So again, to highlight those, there's 2 standards that are really important, including one that requires to protect, restore, and enhance natural habitats, and another one that prioritizes the implementation of nature-based solutions. So that's that adaptive pathways that Geeta's been talking about. Those standards are a huge improvement from the beginning stages of the RSAP, where they were talking about protecting nature because it's pretty. So now we're talking about why it's important to have holistic and connected habitats, as well as nature as a resiliency tool. So this is a huge improvement. And then also those equity assessments, which Geeta also mentioned, they're in every plan element or step, which is forcing planners to think about equity and put our frontline communities at the forefront of this planning effort. Next slide, please. But the challenging news with this, in seeking a comprehensive and all-encompassing document and plan, the result is a pretty long and complex document, which can be quite confusing at times. And then like the critical gaps that we've been citing, so the document itself is at risk of being misunderstood due to these gaps. So it's really imperative at this point, this sort of final push, we emphasize the need for clarity so that the diverse group of stakeholders that is required in order to properly carry out this plan are all able to access, understand, and uphold all the great things it is talking about regarding nature and frontline communities, regardless of their previous experience or education with that. Next slide, please. So before I talk about ways we believe the RSAP can be strengthened, just wanted to give another little brief refresher on some key sections in this discussion. So the first is those adaptation strategy standards. So Arthur mentioned most of these sections previously, but again, those are under the minimum standards. So these are what are required of the plan, sort of the meat of the plan, what is going to carry out that One Bay vision. So the One Bay vision is the next thing I have listed. These are the goals of the plan, what the RSAP is setting out to complete. So then there's a direct relationship between those 2 sections, and that's kind of where we see a lot of those gaps, is whether or not the standards really reflect these One Bay visions and believing they can be strengthened to better do so. The next section we have there is the strategic regional priorities, which is what Arthur was talking about in BCDC's acknowledgement that the Bay is a very diverse place when we think ecologically, geologically, hydrologically, socially, different needs. And now all these things definitely impact the whole Bay, but can really only be addressed in certain regional areas. So these are, again, things that are required by those jurisdictions that are denoted to be impacted by these things. And then the last relevant area here is those plan elements. Those are the steps. So of the actual plan that will be coming out of this document. So sort of an outline of all the areas of consideration for the adaptation plan. These are things like existing conditions, vulnerability assessments, and adaptation strategies. And then those last 2 sections, the strategic regional priorities, as well as the plan elements, contain checklists for planners. These are pretty high level, just few words or sentence to make sure that everything is incorporated. And again, that's a place where we can see a lot of things that we want to see be strengthened, sort of included there to strengthen these points. Next slide, please. So our goals when delivering a public comment on this is to first commend the progress that's been made on the RSAP. And this is not just to be considerate, it's also acknowledging that this is a draft. So there is a lot of really good things in there, but it's not the final thing. So it's still really important to make those pushes for the things we like in there and talk about why that's so important that they're still included. Which brings us to our next point. To be explicit that there's still work to be done. So there's these gaps that I'm going to delve a little deeper into, Guido mentioned, but these gaps that need to be bridged. So that brings us to our third point, which is to communicate the ways in which we think the RSAP can be strengthened to address those bridges, and arguably the most important part, which is why it's so important that we even address these gaps. So like, what's the significance of these gaps? All right, next slide. So our first area for strengthening is the fact that bay ecosystems are on the front line for sea level rise. And when we say that, we mean they're at risk, yes, as they are a shoreline, they're our first point of contact with a rising tide, but they also present a lot of invaluable opportunities to provide resiliency. We also currently owe a lot of our resiliency to nature, whether or not we recognize it. That can be seen in temperature regulation, flood regulation, carbon sequestration. These are all benefits that we experience day to day and maybe not acknowledged. But if we let these ecosystems drown, we're also losing the opportunity to leverage those ecosystem services and enjoy those benefits and account for them in our future to ensure that we can continue to reap the benefits. So we believe that bay ecosystem health needs to be better prioritized throughout the RSAP and could better be acknowledged that a healthy bay ecosystem is not just healthy habitat and wildlife, it's also a healthy community, it's also a healthy economy. It also has impacts on public works and transportation processes. So it's really important that we aren't thinking of nature just as this one thing, but sort of thinking about how nature impacts all the different aspects of these plans. And again, that goes back to thinking about the diverse group of stakeholders that'll be interacting with this plan. We don't want someone, for example, who's concerned about transportation thinking that nature maybe doesn't apply to their section or doesn't apply to their work, because nature is really important to everything in our societies, especially here in the Bay. Next slide, please. Which brings us to our second point, which is the need to clarify requirements to ensure nature and nature-based solutions be prioritized and implemented wherever feasible. So the ways that we can really see this be strengthened is in those element checklists that we were talking about before. So it would be great to see those adaptation standards that are required integrated into those checklists so that they don't become an afterthought or get lost anywhere. That they're straight at the forefront of the planning effort. So it would be a great place to see those adaptation standards, especially the ones who are particularly strong with nature, be included in those checklists. Another thing we'd like to see included in those checklists is a do no harm approach to ecosystem health and resilience. So really thinking about how implementing these adaptation strategies throughout our plans will impact our ecosystem health and resilience, and considering those impacts. Next slide, please. So our third point to strengthen is in terms of groundwater rise and contamination standards. So as Guido was mentioning, as our sea levels rise, they're going to be pushing our freshwater underground aquifers closer to the surface, which poses risks for a lot of underground infrastructure, such as sewage and water contamination, as well as just contaminated sites. There's hundreds of contaminated sites across the Bay Area, some of which that are deemed closed, which means they have been cleaned up. But again, as a reminder, those standards of what is cleaned as a contamination site are they're assuming that these areas will always stay dry. But now as they're going to be inundated by sea level rise and rising water, who knows what that means for the mobilization of these contaminants. So we'd like to see some standards really strengthened in these areas in the plan so that we're really thinking about these things. So the first is to expand the environmental justice standard that accounts for the threats of groundwater rise only as flooding. So again, there's a slew of other impacts of groundwater rise, such as infrastructure and that really big contamination risk. And then talking about contamination, as Gita mentioned before, contamination is mentioned in the standards to be prioritized in environmental justice communities, which is great. But we believe this standard could really be strengthened and expanded to add a contamination standard that applies to non-environmental justice communities as well, because we think it's really important that all jurisdictions and communities are thinking about contamination and thinking about how this can really become a public health issue and an ecological health issue very quickly. So next slide, please. And then our final point, of course, is to define those metrics, setting for habitat goals, showing how we're improving on these goals. So the RSAP currently requires that strategies support habitat goals, but it doesn't provide any metrics for how you can track that or what these goals really mean numbers-wise. So we would like to see a new standard created that defines measurable goals for these habitat goals, and also requires a way for plans to demonstrate contributions to them. So this can provide BCDC with a way to track progress on these goals, as well as to ensure accountability, to make sure that everyone's plans are doing what they set out to do and what they said they were going to do. Next slide, please. So those were all the areas we believe the RSAP can mainly be strengthened in. So moving into how you're actually going to deliver your public comment, here's a little comment blueprint. So this is a reminder that this public comment is an opportunity for you to talk about why this specifically matters to you as a resident of the Bay Area. So start with introducing yourself. What's your name? Where do you live? Maybe your occupation. Next, explain why you care. So like, what is your connection to the Bay and why does it matter to you that it's protected? Maybe you're a longtime Bay Area resident, or you enjoy recreating in the Bay, or you're a bird watcher. You care about the conservation of these habitats. That's really important to show a personal connection, of course. And then your third little part of this comment is to make your ask. So this is where you want to spend the bulk of your 2 minutes that you're probably going to have. So that is to answer this question of, in what ways do you want to see the RSAP strengthened? So that could be what we just talked about, or if there's something else that you personally think is an issue with the RSAP, that's what you want to focus the bulk of your comment on. So what that gap is, how that can be addressed, and why that's so important to be addressed. And then you want to conclude by thanking commissioners for their time to be professional and courteous. Thank you. All right, next slide.
All right. Hello, everyone. Now that you have all of the info on the RSAP, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the logistics and sort of the mechanics of actually delivering a public comment here. It's nice to meet you all. My name is Dasha Leeds. I'm the conservation coordinator for the Sierra Club Lower Prieta chapter, and let's hop right in. Next slide, please. So the first step in terms of delivering any public comment. So, these comments will be useful not only for delivering comments at the upcoming October 17th BCDC Commission meeting, but at any future public meeting for almost any jurisdiction you can think of. So the first step that I always do is I find the meeting agenda and I see if there's a Zoom link in the agenda. Fortunately, as you can see from the screenshots here, the October 17th Commission meeting does allow for Zoom participation. So I always check the meeting date, the meeting time, and do they allow for remote participation? Some meetings allow for you to view it remotely, but not to comment. So it is also good to double check as to whether or not they allow for public comment via Zoom as well. Next slide, please. So once you found the agenda, the next step is just to read it and plan ahead for how you deliver your public comment. So just some things that are running through my head whenever I'm first reading through an agenda is, number one, what item am I speaking on? In this case, at the October 17th meeting, it would be item number 8. Number 2, where is that item on the agenda? You can see that it looks like, given that it's number 8, that it might be pretty far down. But when I look at the agenda items ahead of it, call to order, that's going to take no time at all. They're just going to check to make sure everyone's seated. Then there's public comment. That's where people talk about items not on the agenda. That won't take very long. There are a couple reports. There's a consent calendar item that will also be pretty quick. So even though it's item 8, for this October 17th meeting, I would actually recommend showing up closer to the start of the meeting just to make sure you catch this item. And agendas will always flow from top to bottom. So if you're agenda item 8, you can be sure that, if you're watching the Zoom link and you see that they're on agenda item 7, you can be like, well, I'm up next, so I better, get my public comment paper ready to go next to my computer. Or if you're in person, just sort of mentally prep yourself to walk up to the podium. But the next step after I figure out where my item is in the agenda is I read the details of the item. So as you can see here, you can click the top of the hyperlink to read the staff report. And there are also, in this case, 3 appendixes that you can read. So for example, as part of this update, it would also amend several San Francisco Bay Plan climate change findings and policies. Oh, that's really interesting. We can learn more about that by clicking Appendix C and reading more about what proposed changes would happen. Next slide, please. So I'm going to cover a couple different ways to speak. Number 1 is speaking via Zoom on the day of the meeting. I actually just came from another Zoom meeting to here, so I'm like fresh off of another public comment. They're actually very easy and super impactful. So if you can do it, I really would recommend doing it. So one thing I love to do via Zoom is I show up early and I just listen to the progress of the meeting while I wait for my item to be heard. That way I ensure that I'm not going to miss my item and that I'm, mentally prepared when it gets close to my time to speak. As soon as the item starts, or right, our item would be item 8 in this case. As soon as you hear, item 8, they're talking about the RSAP, you click raise hand on Zoom. And when you do that, that puts you in queue for public comment. The sooner you raise your hand in most jurisdictions, the sooner you'll get to speak, which is really nice. As you can see on the bottom of the slide here, raise hand will be a button at the bottom of your screen. Usually the public Zooms have very limited options, so it's usually just one of 2 buttons that you can click. Do note that unlike Zooms like today, your camera will not be active during this meeting. In some jurisdictions, your profile picture may be used, but in the case for BCDC, your profile picture will not be used. So it will just be your Zoom name. So if you have a silly Zoom name, make sure to change that unless you want a silly Zoom name. A little tip that I use is I love to join Zoom with my phone, and I just have headphones plugged into my phone. And that way I can just like pace around my room or like go do chores or really just be mobile while I'm waiting for this item to start, and I'm not just fixed to my computer for however long it takes for them to get to my item. So I can always listen to the progress of the meeting wherever I am. Next slide, please. If you want to speak in person on the day of the meeting, that's like a level up from Zoom comments in terms of your impact. You can actually look the commissioners in the eye. They can see the emotion on your face. It's super, super impactful. So if you have the time to do this, I recommend trying it out, delivering an in-person public comment. When you walk into a public meeting, you're going to need, the first thing you're going to want to do is find a comment card. They'll usually be in a table close to the entrance of the meeting room. You'll take that comment card and you'll fill out your name and the number of the agenda item that you want to speak on. So for us, I'd put Dashiell leads agenda item 8. There will be other questions on the comment card. You don't need to answer them. So I take that comment card and I will deliver it to the city clerk. Sometimes there's a comment card drop box next to the city clerk. So yeah, once you put that information in the box, you're effectively in queue. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the flow of each individual agenda item, right? So it's item 8, our item is starting. How do we anticipate what's going to happen? So first, there's going to be a presentation by staff, and this is usually how it flows. These things are always subject to change, but this is like the general expectation. So number 1, staff is just going to present on whatever the topic of the item is. Then commissioners or elected officials, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, will ask clarifying questions. They're usually not allowed to make public statements or opinions at this time. Then it's your time to shine. It's public comment time. And I'll talk a little bit about the process of delivering that public comment. After everyone, yourself included, has delivered your public comments, it's time for the commissioners to now discuss. And this is where they talk about all their opinions, they give direction to staff, they give feedback. And then if there is a vote for the item, I believe for item 8, there is no vote. It's just a public hearing. So I don't think we can expect a vote on October 17th, but if there is a vote, it will happen last on the item. And this is usually how agenda items flow. Sometimes it's subject to change. Sometimes I've seen, for really, really packed rooms, elected officials will say, you know what, let's just hop straight into public comment. So it's always good to listen to the meeting and just to be on your toes. Next slide, please. If you don't want to speak, I totally understand. It can be really nerve-wracking to talk to a group of people. I'll go a little bit into why actually having nerves is kind of an advantage. But if you do want to avoid the in-person speaking or Zoom speaking, you can still have a huge impact. So you can visit the BayAdapt website. There's a URL here, and I think that'll be made available for you to actually click on through the slide deck. You're going to go to the website that I've screen capped on the right. There's a few ways that you can interact with this here. So you can take the survey. They call it the RSAP comment form, but when you click on it, it actually takes you to about a 7-minute survey. You can also contact the commission directly. So you can email a comment to publiccomment@bcdc.ca.gov with the letters RSAP in the subject line and write your comment there. You can also actually send snail mail. So if you want to do it old school, you can do that as well. If you have like a petition, sometimes it can be great to actually send in the physical petition. But of course, even better, if you have a physical petition, you can show up in person and just like show them, and that's great too. So yeah, next slide, please. So let's say I'm on Zoom. What actually happens when it's time for me to deliver a public comment? Well, the first thing that's going to happen is the clerk is going to call out my name. They'll say Dasher Leeds. And if I'm on Zoom, a pop-up is going to show up and it's going to ask me to unmute my microphone. So I will just click unmute my mic, and you can just start speaking immediately after you click unmute. And if you're in person, they'll call your name. You'll walk up to the microphone to speak, and you'll usually get 2 minutes or less for a public comment. Generally, what I do is I plan to have 2 minutes or less for a public comment, and I'll identify like 1 or 2 paragraphs or just like key portions of my public comment that have like the critical components of what I want to say. And in the event that it's a packed meeting, sometimes when there's a ton of speakers, commissioners or officials at their discretion will reduce the amount of time you have to speak. So you could show up with a 2-minute public comment, but only be given 1 minute or less to speak. Well, in that case, I've already highlighted my most important sentences, so I can just adapt on the fly and adapt my comment to that shorter time window. Next slide, please. All right, so in terms of tips for constructing your comment, and when we do the breakout groups, we may want to go back to Jenna's slide because she had like a really good step-by-step way of addressing the BCDC here. But again, plan for 2 minutes or less. If you are speaking with your voice, like your in-person or Zoom voice, being nervous is a huge advantage. If you are struggling to get through your comment, it shows that you are committed. And that really demonstrates authenticity, and authenticity goes a long way in public meetings. So just know, if you're nervous, you actually kind of have superpowers, and don't worry about it. It's kind of a win-win. If you're good at speaking, fine. If you're bad at speaking, even better. So don't worry about it. If you do have any personal experiences, emotions related to the topic, in this case would be connections to the Bay, these are super valid, they're really impactful, and they can really strengthen the ask of your public comment. Next slide, please. And that's it. I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Delivering public comments may seem intimidating at first, but I guarantee you, once you deliver your first 1 or 2 public comments and you get that nice dopamine rush of having completed speaking, it's just exhilarating. And it's actually so easy. You can have such an impact on so many different public processes, the RSAP included, but even beyond, by giving public comments. So we do hope to see you out there in the public meetings. Next slide, please. So if you got your phones handy, we do have a couple QR codes for you. You can scan the top code to sign up to join us on the October 17th BCDC Commission meeting. And the bottom code you can scan to send a petition letter and to tell your friends and neighbors about this as well. So I'd recommend taking your phone out, scanning these things, or even just screenshotting it. I think this will be available on the slide deck after the presentation as well. Next slide, please. And I think that is it. I think this is, thanks so much for being here, everyone.
Thanks, Dash. So much. I'm going to jump in here really quick before we move to breakout groups and just let everybody, I'd like to open it up for questions again. We do have a question in the chat that I'm hoping our panel can offer some guidance on. Ginny wants to know if we can give some ideas for defining measurable goals. So we talked about the 100,000 acres for tidal marsh. Do we have ideas about specific metrics we'd like to see, or do we want BCDC just to, well, I think Arthur, you probably know a lot about what their thinking is about that.
Yeah, well, I think from our perspective, the metrics we're interested in are the ecosystem metrics. And because we actually do have numbers out there that have been pretty much accepted by everybody. So the idea that we should have 100,000 acres of tidal marsh in San Francisco Bay has been around since 1999, and over 100 scientists developed those goals under the leadership of the US EPA and the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board, those kind of agencies. So it's very much accepted numbers. And again, as Gita said, way back when the Bay had 200,000 acres of tidal marsh, at its lowest point, we had only 32,000 acres of tidal marsh. I mean, that's a ridiculously small number. And we brought it up to around 54,000 now because people realize how important it is, and restoration of wetlands has been going on. And so those numbers are there for tidal marsh. And there are also numbers for other habitats that have been established for eelgrass beds, which is a submerged aquatic vegetation that's really important, and for other kinds of habitats. So those numbers are there. When it comes to transportation and housing, we don't really have opinions of what those numbers should be. We have regional agencies that have already adopted numbers. And so there are numbers out there. But I think our focus is, when we're talking metrics, we're talking about metrics for the ecosystem and bay habitats.
I can only add to that by saying that this is going to be a new thing for them. So this is going to be something for which they need to set up a committee to plan on what kind of metrics they would like to see. And we would only be interested in contributing for, as Martha said, to the ecosystem health and habitat. So we can come up with various things for habitat. You know, there are habitat goals for creatures, you know, birds. When you see more pelicans in your near shoreline, that would be something, you know, that we can come up with these kinds of things, like the kind of birds that are showing up, a number of sightings for endangered species would be one. Whether the wastewater systems are in fact using nature-based adaptations to clean the water in your particular sub-regional area. So we can definitely come up with them. So I think it's a great question, and I think this is something that we will work with them, or we will ask them to start working on, is to come up with metrics for all of their guidelines.
I'll just jump in there also to say, you know, I don't think in terms of the ecosystem categories, the habitat, types of different habitats, I don't think we're looking for BCDC to divvy up all the cities and say, you have to produce this much, you have to produce that much. We really want to have the RSAP set a region-wide goals, and that's where we're talking about the 100,000 acres of tidal marsh. And what we want the local plans to do is identify how they will contribute to it. And we certainly know that some areas will be able to contribute more than others, just based on how developed their shoreline is already, or a number of other issues. But we want to have that target, and we want BCDC to be tracking progress towards it. And we want localities to be really thinking front and center about how they can help the region as a whole meet those goals, and be required to explain how they've tried to do it. And if they didn't, why not? I have another question. How does one shoreline fit in here?
In fact, one shoreline is a jurisdiction similar to Valley Water and Caltrans, which has roads all the way around the bay, which are not required by this law to fit in to produce these plans. However, BCDC is working closely with them and is trying to figure out exactly how they will be integrated into the sub-regional plans. So one shoreline is a San Mateo County, and Valley Water is Santa Clara County. So if the sub-region has two parts in San Mateo County, one shoreline will be involved in both of them, but it will not be the entity that's submitting it. It will be the county that'll be submitting it. So they are trying to figure that out. Like the other one, classic one would be sewage treatment, wastewater treatments. There are only X number of treatment plants around the bay, but there are a great many more cities. So many cities contribute to them, and some of them cross-pollinate. Like certain things go to a certain wastewater treatment and others go to another one. So they also they're trying to figure out how these should be controlled within the RSAP. So yes, they are tackling that right now.
And this is new legislation. Some things are not clear. For example, I mean, it does require every city and county to develop a plan. The fact that the one shoreline was created to represent all those cities may or may not. Right now, BCDC is taking the position that that means those cities are not individually responsible. But we'll see how that plays out.
Do we have any other questions? We could probably take one more.
Well,
Go ahead,
just to
Arthur.
go on with one shoreline, it's an example of why it's important, actually. It's a good example of why, if the RSAP works, it will be a great benefit to us, because you're probably familiar with the proposal from one shoreline that the way to make everything work for them and be easy is to just put a seawall from the airport down to below Burlingame, dam off 650 acres of the bay, 2.5 miles of shoreline, and Bob's your uncle. You don't have to worry about sea level rise because you're not going to have the sea anymore. There's been a lot of pushback on that. I'm not sure if that concept is still, I'm sure it's still moving because their director is very stubborn about these things. But it's a good example of why we should be appreciative of that. There is an RSP process and just work to make it as strong as possible.
How do these breakout rooms work, Jim?
All right. Wills, can you put that slide back up? The one just before, no, it's down towards the bottom. Just go up from the slide you're on right now. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. And yeah, perfect. So we're going to go to breakout rooms to practice making comments and cover any questions about comment making that you might have. Since we covered a lot of ground here tonight, we're gonna take probably the first 3 or 4 minutes to give you all a chance to take a look at the talking points that we just put in the chat and jot down your ideas of what you might want to say in a public comment. And then we'll go around and do some practice and help each other figure out how to make our comments better.
So the talking points is a link in the chat, is that right?
Yes, it's a link in the chat. And I'll put it in again. Whoops.
It's quite, okay, it's quite long, all right. But it summarizes what we've just been talking about.
Yeah.
I would also say that one of the comments that one might make is that the RSAP probably could be strengthened by being simplified and clarified a bit and taking some of the redundancy out. So that is something that I don't think you need to say that, but anyone who has read it can say that. If they can say honestly, I've read through the RSAP and in my humble opinion, so forth. Go ahead, Jen, sorry.
All right, so I'm gonna set up 4 rooms and while everybody's taking their couple of minutes to look at the talking points and think about what it is they want to say, I will move people around a little bit to make sure we have a Bay Alive leader in each group.